Good afternoon. May I have a mover and seconder to call the meeting to order, please? I have Councilors Garwood and Alexander that the special meeting of Council of the Township of Springwater of October 2nd, 2024 come to order at 4 p.m. All those in favor? And that has carried. Councilor, any disclosures of pecuniary interest? And not seeing any, may I have a mover and seconder to move into close, please? I have Councilors Moore and Fisher that in accordance with Section 239 of the Municipal Act 2001, the Corporation of the Township of Springwater does hereby resolve to move into closed session at 4:01 p.m. for a discussion pertaining to litigation, potential litigation, including matters before administrative tribunals affecting the municipality or local board, advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose. Our topics today are OLT update, 2023-00464 Ballymore, update on OLT 2023-00990 Lewis Pitt, update OLT 24-00188 3024 Old Second South. All those in favor? And that has carried. Oh, I do need quorum though, because we still have resolutions. Thank you. Not everybody can go. And so, council, we do have two, do you want to rise my report then?
Yep.
So that we would have, our first is that update on OLT 23000990 Lewis Pitt, and that staff be directed to proceed as in closed session. I need a mover and seconder for that, please. Councillor Moore and Thompson. Council, all those in favor? And that has carried. And our second resolution, again, and this is pertaining to OLT 24000188 3024 Old Second South, and that staff proceed as directed in closed session. I need a mover and seconder for that, please. I have Councillors Fisher and Thompson. All those in favor? And that has carried. And we'll just take a quick break here before, or you're good? Okay. We'll take 5 minutes before we break into it. Everybody needs Hi, Council, we can reconvene. And at this time, I will turn to our presenter. Oh, I'll go to CEO Schmidt first.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin. Before we turn things over to our consultant from PSD Citywide, Mr. Ibrahim, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank one of our staff members here, Ms. Palucci, who has played a pivotal role in getting our asset management plan to where it is today. Ms. Palucci, we had an opening, if you will, a vacancy in our asset management coordinator position while an individual went on maternity leave, and Ms. Palucci agreed to step in on a temporary basis to help us continue to move this project forward. So again, just wanted to thank Ms. Palucci for her assistance in getting us to where we are today. We're here to answer any questions once the presentation's over.
Thank you for that. And I'll turn over to our presentation now.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. If I may, I'm going to start by sharing my screen and we'll take it from there. I just want to confirm that everybody can see my screen. Right?
Yes, we can.
So, as you may know, what we're going to be presenting today is basically the findings of the 2024 Asset Management Plan for the Township of Springwater. This is not my first asset management presentation at Springwater. I did present the findings of your 2022 plan, and we also did an SMT meeting a while back talking about asset management and the requirements of the province of Ontario and what so on and so forth. My name is Zaidu Ibrahim. I'm a senior advisor and a team lead at PSD Citywide. And with this, I'll move forward and I'll go to my next slide. So let's start a bit with the why. Why do we do asset management and where does asset management help? First and foremost, as you may know, it is required by the province of Ontario for municipalities to have up and running asset management plans, because that's something that's regulated in Ontario. It's not regulated elsewhere in Canada, but effectively you folks are in Ontario, so this regulation does apply to you. Whenever we're dealing with asset management, the reason why we invest in that is because it does help us improve the reliability of our systems. And therefore, it helps us reduce the downtime of infrastructure, and it helps in limiting emergency repairs and all of these stuff that we do want to avoid. It also helps in the better long-term system integrity and does help in long-term planning. Therefore, it does help decision makers and policy makers and what they're required to do. It is a practice that really helps in cost saving, because effectively, whenever we're dealing with asset management, we're trying to plan ahead for the future and trying to model life cycle management activities that would help us extend the life of our assets so that we don't have any emergency failures and that we make sure that our assets are functioning at a good state of repair till they're due for replacement. Another key importance or another key advantage when it comes to developing asset management plans is that these plans are typically used by the province and the federal government to determine eligibility for the OSIP and the gas tax moving forward. In other terms, we know that in the communities that we do live in, there's lots of services that are being provided. And the backbone for these services are basically the assets that provide these services or enable these services. And therefore, we need a meaningful way to organize what we own. We need to understand what services we provide, and we need a way to ensure that there is some level of accountability when it comes to that piece of service delivery. From a textbook definition, asset management is the coordinated activity of an organization to derive value from its assets. Or in other terms, it's a way to balance cost, performance, and risk so that we get the best value for our money whenever we're investing in infrastructure, assets, and services. Now, dealing a bit with the Ontario Regulation 58817, which is related to asset management. This regulation started with an asset management policy that was due in 2019, and you folks already have an asset management policy that is up and running. The first or the second key requirement under that regulation was to develop a current levels of service asset management plan for core assets, which means that this plan should report on the current levels of service for the core assets, which are roads, bridges and culverts, stormwater infrastructure, water infrastructure, and wastewater infrastructure. Effectively documenting the lifecycle management activities that are required to provide these levels of service while taking into account the cost that's required or the investment that's required in order to apply these lifecycle management activities. It does also include some documentation around growth and population forecast and employment forecast. That was due in 2022. So that's your previous asset management plan. What's required for 2024, and the focus of today's discussion is the same that was required for 2022, but also including non-core assets. The non-core assets include vehicles, machinery and equipment, parks, land improvements, facilities, etc. So, what we're going to be presenting today is a snapshot, of your current levels of service provided by your core and non-core infrastructure. So that's the focus of today's presentation. There's another major requirement, and if I may say, the most important requirement under that Ontario regulation is to develop an asset management plan focusing on proposed levels of service. And this sequence does make so much sense because in order for you to report on what's proposed or what's desired, effectively you'd have to know where you stand currently, and this is what we're presenting today. Effectively, for the next year, you'd have to make some decisions around what levels of service to enhance, what levels of service to maintain, and what levels of service to decrease in some areas, so that you effectively know what's the best way to manage your infrastructure. Because effectively, whenever we're dealing with service delivery, we have to know that in some areas you may be providing an excellent level of service, but is that really required? In other areas, you might be providing an acceptable level of service, and you might want to maintain it this way. In some other areas, you might be providing a level of service that may need improvement. So depending on the risks of not meeting an acceptable level of service, you should start thinking about how can we modify these levels of service in order to meet the community priorities and expectations. And in 2025 as well, there is a requirement to look at your asset management policy and see whether there is any need for any improvement. Moving forward from there, since this is a process and not a project to a certain extent, every municipality in Ontario is required to update its asset management plan at least once every 5 years. And as part of an annual review process, council should look at the progress achieved when it comes to asset management, because effectively when you start reporting on the proposed levels of service that you do want to reach, you'd have to effectively have some milestones in terms of the timeline, in terms of the actual progress that you want to achieve. Last and not least, whenever adopting any asset management policy or adopting any asset management plans, these plans should always be public facing, and therefore they should be always posted on the municipal website. Now, taking a deeper dive into your asset management plan, the plan that we're going to be presenting today is based on 2023 year-end data, and it does really help us understand what is the current state of municipal infrastructure. So, starting with the total replacement cost of your asset portfolio. The asset portfolio that you own at Springwater, including core and non-core assets, is almost or does have a value that's almost close to $1 billion, which is not small, because if you do look at that value from a per household perspective, it's about $136,000 per household, which is very close to the Canadian average that's around $100,000 according to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So, in other terms, for every house to exist in Springwater, it does need an equivalent of $136,000 worth of infrastructure, which is quite a lot, and people typically tend to ignore that. But effectively, if these infrastructure assets did not exist, the quality of life would be jeopardized, and not many people would live in cities or towns where these infrastructure assets are not present or available. So, effectively, if we do look at the breakdown, we notice that for the most part, the core assets make up the biggest portion of your asset portfolio. Almost 60% of that portfolio is the road network, water network is second, the sanitary network is third, the storm network is fourth, and bridges and culverts come at the fifth place, and all of the other non-core assets are behind because of the fact that they're not that complex, they're not that, heavy in terms of the engineering practice or heavy in terms of the accessibility and availability of these networks. Effectively, when we take a deeper dive and look at the state of the infrastructure, we do have some good news to convey here. About 83% of your assets are in fair or better condition, which is a good indication, to be honest, especially because lots of these assets do depend on very recent condition assessment data. So if you take a deeper dive and look at these data sources, you'd notice that for your road network, which does represent 60% of the total value of your portfolio, the analysis that we're engaging in here is depending on data that's from 2023 that's based on a road needs study, and therefore that's the highest level of data accuracy and completeness that a municipality could reach. The data is very recent; it's based on actual inspections, etc. When it comes to the bridges and culverts, the data is also recent, but you folks have a newer report that would be integrated as part of the next iteration of the asset management plan. For the actual facilities, we do have some building condition assessment data that was used to look at the components and their conditions and their replacement needs and what so on and so forth. It's worth to note that there has been some, efforts in terms of collecting more data around the storm water system, and this is reflected by a CCTV inspection for about 4% of the network and an assessment for your storm water ponds. This being said, all of the other asset categories for all of the other assets included under the other asset categories are using age-based condition, which is effectively dependent on the estimated useful life of these assets and the debt service life remaining. Now, when it comes to the actual condition assessment data, one should focus on the fact that this data is the most important piece within your asset management plan or within your asset management plan. Because whenever we do have consistent inputs or decent inputs and accurate inputs, this is when we can produce consistent and relevant outcomes. Effectively, whenever we have good condition data, we can predict when assets would fade and how they would fade. And we can start evaluating the levels of service when it comes to these assets and make any necessary adjustments based on the risk and the condition of assets. And therefore, whenever we're engaged in this, we can effectively engage in delivering the most economically viable intervention. Because, as you can see here, whenever we're engaged in life cycle modeling or long-term life cycle planning, typically the event trigger for any rehabilitation or replacement activity is condition and age sometimes. So if we do have some accurate representation of that condition, we can then predict with some good level of confidence when these activities would take place. So this example here is basically for a paved road. And as you can see, we do have a few activities that are planned. The first activity is a single surface overlay. The second activity is a double lift mill and pave. And the last activity would be a full reconstruction. These events are triggered by condition, and effectively, if we know that condition, as previously mentioned, we can then know how much to budget for the upcoming years. So, To summarize again, as part of this plan, we've used an end-of-life analysis for the assets, or most of the assets like vehicles, building components, etc. Meaning that we're planning for the replacement of these components and assets towards the end of their estimated useful life. For the roads and bridges and culverts, we've used a more detailed model that is similar to the model that was shown previously, looking at actual rehabilitation events and actual planned events that would add years to the asset or would add condition scores to the assets, etc. Effectively, this is the result of the analysis, and I'd like to spend some time here discussing that. From a backlog perspective, there is about $38.9 million in terms of infrastructure backlog. And what this means is that there are some assets that are either beyond their replacement dates or beyond a certain rehabilitation activity, etc. And it's effectively something to note that this backlog needs to be cleared out. Now, if we do look at the peaks and valleys in the actual analysis, it's really important to note that whenever we're engaged in developing an asset management plan or any type of asset management analysis, we do look at the long term. So we'd like to look at the full life cycle of assets, because if we were only looking at a 10-year period, it might not be very representative of reality. So we'd like to know what's the annualized cost of owning infrastructure. And in this case, it's about $26.1 million. Now, it's not the case for every year where you end up spending $26.1 million exactly, but that's the total average. In some years, you might be spending less. And in these years, you should start building some reserves. And in some years, you might be spending more depending on staff capacity, labor availability, and contractor availability as well. So, just to summarize, what this graph is representing to a certain extent is the fact that for you to maintain the current levels of service that you're providing, you would have to spend around $26.1 million a year on capital reinvestments. And that doesn't include any new assets or any expansion of your asset management. Now, another thing to take into account when we're developing an asset management plan is the risk portion of service delivery or of assets. In this case, we have to acknowledge that whenever we're dealing with a risk analysis, in this specific case, we're looking at risk using the following formula. It's the probability of failure and the consequence of failure. And the probability of failure could be sometimes modeled by looking at the asset condition, the service life remaining. In some cases, maybe for underground utilities, the pipe material may have some influence in terms of probability of failure, because if we're dealing with some cast iron pipes in a corrosive soil environment, these pipes have a higher probability of failure than PVC pipe that's installed elsewhere. Now, when we do look at the consequence of failure piece of the equation, we'd have to look at the financial impacts, maybe looking at replacement cost. The average annual daily traffic, because that's the social impact of failure when it comes to roads. Road design class would also represent a social impact of failure, because depending on the class, you might have a very good indication on the level of traffic on this road, the types of traffic, etc. The pipe diameter for underground utilities is a very good indication of the consequence of failure, because effectively, if you're dealing with a bigger pipe diameter, that might mean that more people or a larger portion of the network might be connected to that pipe, and therefore, if it does fail, more people or more services would be impacted. And we also look at the asset function and what's intended to do from a functional perspective. So, for example, if we're looking at two vehicles of the same type, not travel, if one of them is a fire vehicle, its asset function is a bit more important than a vehicle that might be used for something else. With this being said, it's essential to note that as part of the asset management plan, we've identified what assets fall within the most critical category and other categories as well. And as you can see here, about 16% or $164 million of your assets fall within the critical section of this. which means that these assets could require immediate intervention or, immediate attention to a certain extent. Because if some of these assets or some of these analyses are based on accurate information, then these assets would require immediate action. In a case where we may have some doubts in terms of the information that's conveyed, these assets would require immediate attention in terms of collecting more data on whether these are assets that are prone to failure in the near future or not. So effectively looking at some of the numbers that were presented earlier and looking at some of the numbers that were presented as part of your 2022 plan. Back then, our analysis showed that for tax funded assets, you were funded at 27% of your total annual requirements or long-term requirements, whereas for rate funded assets, for water and wastewater, you were funded at 25%, which means that there is a deficit of 73 to 75% in terms of capital renewal. Now, looking at the results of this plan, the total value of your portfolio increased from $21.3 million to $26.1 million due to the inclusion of non-core assets, including vehicles, machinery, equipment, buildings, etc., and to the update that we made to the replacement cost. Because effectively, whenever we're dealing with a capital projection or whenever we're dealing with replacement costing and whatnot, we have to make sure that these numbers are reasonable. Because as you folks know for sure, inflation is something to take into account at all times, especially in the recent years, because the cost of materials, the cost of labor, the cost of construction has increased tremendously. This being said, we do believe that there is an anticipated existing infrastructure deficit because effectively if your tax numbers and rate numbers didn't catch up with inflation in the previous deficit, we would assume that you're still in a deficit position. Now, with this being said, the analysis only depends on sustainable funding sources, which means that what we're taking into account here are taxes, rates, gas tax, also sources of revenues that are considered sustainable by the province. But with this being said, we do acknowledge that there are some sources of funding that are one-off and that may not be recurring, but would still be used for infrastructure renewal and infrastructure reinvestment. One thing that we have to take into account here is whenever we're dealing with the 2025 requirements later on and proposed levels of service, this is when we have to take that infrastructure deficit into account. Because if we're already operating at a deficit, it would be very hard to promise increasing levels of service because that would come at a higher cost and therefore would come at a higher, tax rate or rates in general. So this is something that we have to take into account whenever engaging in any prioritization mechanism for infrastructure renewal. Effectively, some of the key takeaways of this plan are that with the adoption of this plan, we would be compliant with the 2024 regulation requirements, but there are some further improvements that would need to happen before July 1st of 2025 in order for you to become compliant with that piece of the regulation. One thing that we have to acknowledge is that whatever is presented here is a snapshot in time, because what we're dealing with here is dynamic data, and therefore that data would need to be updated every once in a while, and this is why starting from 2025, every municipality in Ontario would need to update its asset management plan at least once every 5 years. The asset management plan should be a living document and it should never collect dust because effectively, from a best practice perspective, it should be the plan that does guide budgeting, capital planning, etc. And one thing to take into account is that whenever you develop such a plan, it should be seen as a centralized source for the asset information that the municipality does possess. And effectively, it's a very good communication tool to the public, council, internal staff, because it does represent the current state, the infrastructure, and does also represent what's planned for the future for or in terms of infrastructure renewal and reinvestment. In terms of the actual recommendations as part of this asset management plan, we do encourage you to continue to build and maintain centralized inventory system, and I would like to emphasize that there has been lots of efforts applied to building that aspect of this plan, and I would like to thank staff who contributed to that. From a life cycle management perspective, it's always required that you take these life cycle models into account and try to represent reality whenever developing these models, so that you do have, or you end up having, some accurate costs and projections whenever it comes to the long-term plan. One other recommendation is to take into account the risk models that we built as part of this plan in terms of your prioritization of activities, because effectively, as mentioned earlier on in discussion, if an asset is at a higher risk, either on the probability of failure side or the consequence of failure side, there might be some treatments that would help us avoid some extensive capital reinvestments due to immediate failures and whatnot. One other recommendation is to start looking at ways to have some discussions around the proposed level of service, because effectively what we presented today is the current state of infrastructure, and what would need to be fulfilled by 2025 is a decision around what level of service should be maintained, enhanced, or decreased. So there should be some conversation starting, like, internally with staff about, okay, where should we go from here? And effectively, at some point, engaging the public when it comes to public expectation and the public's willingness to pay. It's very important as well to start thinking about this as a process and not a project. And with this being said, it's very important to consider adopting or developing an asset management strategy, because there are lots of moving parts here when it comes to asset data, condition data, engineering modeling, other master planning studies, and what so on, what so forth. So it's very important to map all of these initiatives and have some sort of a roadmap to guide you through your asset management journey, because, as it's very clear, this process or this project won't end in 2025. It's becoming more and more a requirement for some funding and some, eligibilities when it comes to senior government money. So the better the program is developed, the higher the odds of you getting more funding or being more competitive when it comes to funding opportunities moving forward. With this being said, I'll open up the floor to any questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. At this time, I will turn to council for any questions or comments. And we are just receiving this, but Deputy.
Thank you, Mayor Coughlin, and through you to Mr. Abraham. I'm just curious, how does our township, since you said you've done a number of these plans, where would you score us in relationship maybe to some of the other municipalities that you've looked at, be they bigger or smaller, as far as our current asset management plan, and how healthy it is as far as, it looked pretty good on the scales and some of the graphs, but how would we be comparing to some other ones? Are we in the same ballpark? Are we a little bit better off? Or because some of the numbers for us, as far as what we need to maintain, are a little bit high?
And a very good question. I've delivered around 60 or 70 similar presentations, and this is always the first question council would ask. Effectively, I'd like to answer this looking at two aspects when it comes to your asset management plan. One, for a municipality of your size, you do own a very large infrastructure portfolio. Maybe due to the size of the municipality or due to the infrastructure, the asset types, etc. Which means that your level of reinvestment for a municipality of your size in terms of population is practically a bit higher than average. That's one piece. Another piece, when it comes to the actual infrastructure deficit, I would say that you fall within where 80 to 90% of municipalities do fall. Around the 50 or 60 municipalities I've worked with, Ontario specifically, I would say that only probably one of them had a very good reinvestment rate. All of the other ones were around 20 to 30% in terms of infrastructure reinvestment. So they're all in your shoes to a certain extent.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anything further, council? Not seeing anything, so at this time I would ask for a mover and seconder, please. I have Councillor Garwood and Deputy Cabral.
One more question.
Deputy.
And it's through you, but actually to staff. Would staff be in a position to prepare? I know for the last number of years we've put extra money into an asset management account or reserve per se. I don't know whether we've been utilizing that. And I know that we also took some of the surplus and we put it in towards the infrastructure piece too. Is it possible to provide council with some kind of an overview of where we're at in respect of those types of dollars? It doesn't have to be right now. I mean, at some point in time. Thank you.
Follow up with that. Thank you. So I have it moved and seconded that the presentation from PSD Citywide regarding the Township of Springwater's 2024 Asset Management Plan be received and that a report be presented at a future meeting of council seeking final approval of the Asset Management Plan. Council, all those in favor? And that has carried. May I have a mover and seconder for the confirmation bylaw, please? I have Councillors Thompson and Moore. That bylaw 2024-078 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of council in the special meeting held on October 2nd, 2024, listed here and be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All those in favor? And that has carried. And a mover and seconder to adjourn, please. I have Councillors Fisher and Alexander that the special meeting of the Township of Springwater does now adjourn at 5:39 p.m. to meet again, the regular meeting on October 2nd, 2024 at 6:30 p.m. All those in favor?